Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Colin McLeod, and I'm a professor at the University of Melbourne and the Executive Director of the University's Entrepreneurial Centre. Welcome to the 2021 Menzies Oration, to be delivered by Professor Paul Tracey from the University of Cambridge. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where I am today, which, like many of you in Melbourne, is my home, with a virtual background. And the traditional owners of this area are the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to extend that respect to any First Nations people with us today. I have to admit that in acknowledging the first Australians, it's hard not to contrast their successful custodianship of this land over tens of thousands of years with our world today, where the UN Sustainable Development Goals seem more necessary but even more daunting. While many people and organisations have embraced and supported the SDGs, there is still a lot of uncertainty about how much progress we've made since they were first announced, and perhaps more importantly and more relevant at the moment, what's needed to bring them into reality by 2030. Fortunately, we have both an outstanding guest speaker to deliver the Menzies Oration and an outstanding discussion panel to help guide us through this challenging topic. We do have one change to the panel, and that is that Gail Peterson has unfortunately had some health issues and is unable to join us tonight. But Gail has very kindly recorded the video giving her views on tonight's topic, and we'll play Gail's video during the course of the evening. I think many of you would be aware that the Menzies Oration is an annual event hosted by the Menzies Foundation and the University of Melbourne. In view of the fact that one of the inescapable topics for tonight is the impact of COVID-19, I think it's worth noting that Professor Duncan Maskell, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, was announced yesterday as a new Director of CSL. Given Duncan's background as a distinguished researcher and an entrepreneur in the field of immunology and biomedicine more generally, and his board experience in major public pharmaceutical companies in the UK, and the role that CSL has to play both locally and globally in the fight against COVID-19, this is a significant, timely and welcome announcement. And I'd now like to introduce Professor Maskell to welcome you on behalf of the University of Melbourne.
Thank you very much, Colin. I will try to be very brief, but I also want to add my own warm words of welcome to everybody this evening. It's very sad that tonight has to be another lockdown event, but to compensate, we do have some great discussion ahead of us. I start by also acknowledging the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander traditional custodians of the land on which we work and learn. Mindful that we will be thinking a lot about leadership this evening, I pay my respects to Indigenous elders, past, present and emerging. And I acknowledge all Indigenous people participating in this event. I also acknowledge the place of Indigenous knowledge in the Academy. I acknowledge and welcome our friends from the Menzies Foundation, particularly the Foundation's CEO, Liz Gillespie, and the Chair of the Board, Peter Joplin. And above all, of course, a warm welcome to our colleague from the University of Cambridge in the UK, who is joining us online to deliver this year's Menzies Oration, Professor Paul Tracey. Of course, the Menzies Oration honours the memory of one of the University of Melbourne's most distinguished alumni in Sir Robert Menzies, who was not only Australia's longest serving Prime Minister, but also a leader who was passionate about the cause of higher education. Sir Robert's commitment to higher education was reflected, among other things, in his close lifelong association with this university, both as an alumnus and in later life as the university's Chancellor. The Menzies Oration on Higher Education at the University of Melbourne was established in 1991 and has drawn a distinguished list of international and Australian orators over subsequent decades. In line with the Menzies Foundation, the oration now provides an opportunity to focus on initiatives of high national importance, which of course brings us to the theme of this year's address and panel discussion. Tonight we will hear Professor Paul Tracey speak on the United Nations Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. Agenda 2030 was established in 2015 with all 193 member states of the United Nations committing to an ambitious global agreement to pursue sustainable development and reach a new economic equilibrium by the year 2030. This is a theme of enormous importance, not only for governments and nations, but also for universities. I know that the Sustainable Development Goals are a key focus for many of our researchers and students across many disciplines, and indeed for the university's leadership group. So we are delighted to be associated with this year's oration and to welcome to deliver it Paul Tracey, who is Professor of Innovation and Organisation and co-director of the Cambridge Centre for Social Innovation. I also welcome members of our very distinguished panel who will take up the themes offered by Professor Tracey in a discussion after the oration. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us and for being ready to participate in a very important and stimulating conversation about challenges and opportunities ahead. I'll now hand back to you, Colin.
Thanks, Duncan. I should say that from a personal perspective, one of the great parts about being involved in the oration is working with Liz Gillespie as the CEO of the Menzies Foundation. Liz is one of those people who gets things done, and when someone says no to Liz, she just thinks that's their first offer. Liz has got incredibly infectious energy and enthusiasm, but even by Liz's standards, she's gone to a whole new level this year because of her deep passion for tonight's topic. And the fact that we have such an outstanding panel is a very direct reflection of Liz's enthusiasm and energy. So I'd now like to hand over to Liz to welcome you on behalf of the Menzies Foundation.
Oh, Colin, that is a very kind introduction, and I have to say, this is the second year that the oration's had the pleasure of being able to be coordinated with you, and I echo your sentiments and cannot express how fondly I have enjoyed this process and appreciate your contribution tonight. I'm on Bunderong land and would like to similarly acknowledge ancestors and people present and in the future. And I'm just so delighted to be here tonight in partnership and collaboration with the University of Melbourne for the third Menzies Oration in this new series. The Menzies Foundation has a big ambition to raise the profile and importance of outstanding leadership, with a particular focus on encouraging people to reflect on leadership, to build their capability, and to then really think deeply about how they can contribute to the greater good for a flourishing life. The SDGs sit at the very heart of the world's notion of what a flourishing life looks like. And the esteemed panel tonight and our very welcome orator, Paul Tracey, are going to share with us insights around the SDGs, progress to date, and hope and opportunity for the future. And the one message I'd like to convey to the audience from the Menzies Foundation tonight is when you sit and you listen to these people working in global contexts to solve very serious world challenges, I just ask you to pause for a moment and reflect. What type of leader are you? What sort of attributes do you need to develop in order to make a difference in the world, and how can you contribute to the greater good? So with no further ado, it gives me great pleasure to pass back to my friend and compadre, Colin McLeod, as we welcome the orator, Professor Paul Tracey, to tonight's oration. Thanks very much, Colin.
Thanks, Liz. I'm sure that many of the people watching tonight already know something about Paul's background. Otherwise, I guess I wouldn't be here. I know Paul's work pretty well. As Duncan mentioned, Paul is a Professor of Innovation and Organisation at the University of Cambridge. He co-founded the Cambridge Centre for Social Innovation, where he is still the co-director, teaches social entrepreneurship, and through its social enterprise incubator, Cambridge Social Ventures, Paul has supported about 150 social ventures, social entrepreneurs. Paul's own research work encompasses poverty, homelessness, and an extraordinary paper that he wrote late last year, which has been a prize-winning paper in the Academy of Management Journal. If you're an academic, that is like the Mount Everest on top of the Mount Everest, to get to be the best paper in the Academy of Management Journal. And the topic it dealt with was grassroots activism and the way that overcame forced child marriage in a developing nation, which had been institutionalised for centuries, literally in that country. It's an extraordinary piece of scholarship and research. Those of you who have looked at Paul's background will notice he's also a visiting Professor of Entrepreneurship in the Department of Management and Marketing here at the University of Melbourne. And he's been a regular visitor here for almost a decade. And as several people have already said, it's a pity that we can't see Paul in person because he's normally here a couple of times a year before the pandemic hit. Paul's influence within the university has been profound on the way in which we teach entrepreneurship and social innovation specifically. We started designing a massive entrepreneurship program back in about late 2014, and Paul's been a contributor to the design of that program. And every year he comes back as a guest lecturer to our massive entrepreneurship students, which, if I've got my dates right, Paul, you're doing again in about 2 weeks' time for my class. Paul actually has also been, apart from his formal academic activities, has also been a mentor and advisor to the social innovation teams that go through our accelerator programs, such as MAP, as well as members of the broader social innovation ecosystem outside the university. So with that introduction, I'd like to say that in the spirit of thinking globally and act locally, it's my pleasure to introduce someone who is regarded globally as one of the leading figures in social innovation, but locally he's a colleague to many of us here at the University of Melbourne and a close friend, Professor Paul Tracey.
Colin, thank you very much indeed for that warm and kind introduction. Hello everyone, I'm absolutely delighted to have this opportunity to speak with you this evening about a very important set of issues, and also to hear the panel, to join the panel afterwards. I'm sorry we can't be there in person, but I hope to connect with many of you at some point in the future. Let me just share my screen here. So hopefully you can see those slides okay. So today in this oration, I'm going to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and how we can move forward with them. We're faced, as you know, with a range of very profound global challenges. We've still got not far off 1 billion people living in extreme poverty, less than $2 a day. We've got more than 1 billion people without access to electricity, more than 2 billion people who don't have safe drinking water. 82 million people have been forcibly displaced, deep-rooted gender inequalities, a climate emergency. I could go on for a very long time listing the problems and the challenges that we face. And some of these challenges are not always apparent to people living in high-income countries, but they are very, very real. So most of you, I'm sure, in fact, I'm sure all of you will be familiar with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which, as Duncan mentioned, is a plan, a strategy, a roadmap, if you like, to address these and other issues by 2030. 193 countries signed up to achieving these goals in 2015 at a summit in New York. There are 17 goals in total and some 169 more specific targets that are contained within the goals. And you can see that they cover a whole range of many different issues. At the time, there was a lot of skepticism from many people, including myself, about whether they would make any difference at all or not. But actually, it's been really interesting to see how the ideas associated with the SDGs have been taken up by many different types of organizations. You might have multinational companies, activists, social movement organizations, governments, all having a very different perspective on why particular problems exist and what needs to be done to address those problems. And what the SDGs have done, I think, is to provide a framework and a vocabulary for talking about them. I guess they're what my colleagues in sociology would call a boundary object. They provide the shared ability to sense make. They've also helped, I think, make concrete what is a really complex set of issues and show some of the interconnections between them. So I think they represent a very big step forward in foregrounding and in thinking about how we address the most deep-rooted social and environmental issues. But there's always has to be a but, doesn't there? There always has to be a but. So, despite all the energy that I talked about that the SDGs have generated, we're just not making the progress that we need realistically if we're going to meet the goals by 2030. We're not even close. There was a pretty gloomy editorial in the journal Nature last year, which pointed out that even before the pandemic, just 2 of the 17 SDGs were close to being achieved. And because of the pandemic, it suggested that the SDGs had essentially become unachievable within the timescale and that we needed to recalibrate, to be less ambitious with what we're trying to do. Now, I think it's too soon to be thinking that way, and COVID has, of course, galvanized a lot of people into action, but clearly there is a sense of deep urgency here. I just want to say briefly as well that many people are particularly concerned right now about Goal 5 on gender equality because of what's happening in Afghanistan as we speak, which I wanted to explicitly acknowledge because that is going to push us back, which is, of course, a great concern and very difficult to watch unfold. So part of the skepticism of the Nature editorial that I refer to lies in what has happened in the past. I don't know if people recognize this picture. I like to show this picture to my students in class. I don't know if people recognize this. These were the Millennium Development Goals, the predecessor to the Sustainable Development Goals. And they were announced also with great fanfare in 2000, but we've kind of forgotten about them already. And although the precise legacy of the MDGs is still being dissected and debated by academics and social innovators, it's clear that they didn't achieve as much as we'd hoped. We clearly didn't, for example, eradicate poverty and hunger as per Goal 1. So what do we need to do to make sure that the Sustainable Development Goals don't go the way of the Millennium Development Goals? What do we need to do to actually make meaningful progress on the SDGs by 2030? So I really do wish that I could stand here and tell you in the next 25 minutes exactly what we need to do to achieve all 17 goals by 2030. I really do wish that I could do that. But as we know, life is not that simple. There are no easy or straightforward answers here. I certainly don't have any. If anyone suggests otherwise, then I would say that they are probably not being completely honest with you. So what I want to do in this oration is to draw on my work in the social innovation space over the past 20 years or so to focus on two things. First of all, I want to highlight what I see as 4 blockages in the social innovation ecosystem that I think we need to deal with if we're going to make meaningful progress on the SDGs. And second of all, I want to highlight what many people perceive as a core tension in the SDGs, which is between growth and the climate emergency, and talk about how we might deal with that, because I don't think we can talk about the SDGs without talking about climate. So that's the plan of what I want to say. Okay, so let's dive straight in. Let's start talking about blockages. Why aren't we going faster? Okay, so the first blockage that I want to talk about concerns money. So the UN thinks that we need between $5 and $7 trillion a year to achieve the SDGs. That's a huge amount of money, and that can't all come from government. The total impact investment was estimated at about $715 billion last year, and it's growing fast. It's growing very, very fast, and that is clearly very positive news. It's clearly to be welcome, because we need that resource, we need that capital. Otherwise, the SDGs are going to be out of reach. However, we also need these investors to engage. At the moment, we have this rapidly growing impact investor movement, which doesn't really seem to want to engage. There was a recent study from the UK, which I think is really interesting. It found that while 93% of impact investors said they aligned their objectives with the SDGs, only 48% aimed to achieve any of the 169 specific targets, and only 11% actually engaged with communities, customers, workers, and other stakeholders to understand the impact that they were having or not having. Just 11% were actively engaged. So if investors don't engage, how do they try to figure out the impact of their capital? Well, mostly they rely on high-level targets and indicators, often using data that varies massively in quality. Sometimes that can be okay, but often it's completely inadequate, and sometimes it's making things worse. Let me give you a simple example from my own experience of how this can make things worse. About 10 years ago, I was volunteering for a social enterprise in the UK. And at that time, there were a series of contracts, performance-related contracts, put out to tender to help unemployed people get back into the labour market. And success in that context was simply measured by a proportion of clients who moved into and stayed in employment for X months, so many months. Now, a whole bunch of private companies came in to fulfill those contracts, but they were screening a lot of the clients. So they might filter out people who've been out of work for a long time. They might filter out people with disabilities. They might filter out people with criminal records. And they would focus instead on the easy, in inverted commas, cases that they thought they could place. The rest were left for others to pick up, the social enterprises and the non-profits. And so on paper, it looked like these private organizations were doing this amazing job helping all these people back into work. And the social enterprises, like where I was, it looked like they were doing a terrible job. They were hardly placing anyone. But the reality on the ground told a very different story, because the social enterprises were helping very different types of people that had more complex needs. And you could only see that, you could only understand that dynamic through direct engagement, through close engagement with the organizations and communities that were doing the work. And so the point of that story is that we need impact investors to engage, and we need to build understanding about how the organizations, communities that they're investing in actually work. Now, this can be resource intensive, and investors need to work closely with intermediaries on the ground. But unless impact investors actually engage, it doesn't matter how much capital we raise, it doesn't matter how much the impact investment grows, it's not going to achieve the sort of fundamental change that we need to meet the goals. There's some really great examples of engaged impact investment, but I would say not enough. So that's the first blockage. The second blockage I want to talk about relates to companies. So one of the big differences between the Sustainable Development Goals and the Millennium Development Goals has been the foregrounding of the private sector. So the UN realised early on that without the resources and the capacity for innovation of companies around the world, it's not going to be possible to meet the goals. And so we've seen a lot of effort to engage companies, including in the design of the goals themselves. So Paul Polman, for example, the former CEO of Unilever, he was closely consulted in the construction of the SDGs. But while there's a lot of rhetoric, and there's some amazing individual case studies that we can talk about later, maybe in the discussion, corporate engagement with the SDGs has so far, in many ways, been superficial. There was a big study by 2 Dutch sustainability researchers that was published last year, which I think is really interesting. So they looked at the 2,000 largest stock listed companies in the world and measured their engagement with the SDGs, or sought to measure their engagement with the SDGs. And what they found was that while most of these companies were talking about the SDGs, first of all, they weren't actually bringing them into core strategy. And second of all, they weren't making specific commitments to meet them. And so this, on the slide here, this is the author's bottom line. Corporate involvement in the SDGs is overall still limited. Companies treat the SDGs as a scheme with non-committal implications. So it's interesting that that's a pretty damning indictment. It's interesting that the only exceptions that they found were firms in parts of Asia, Japan, South Korea, Thailand. And one of the explanations there is that the state in these countries played a much more active role both in promoting the SDGs and in designing a system of regulation to enforce them. So that is interesting and suggests that voluntary codes are probably not going to work. And what these researchers hinted at, and what others have asked more directly, is whether big established firms are actually capable of transforming themselves so that the purpose is at the core of what they do, or whether really we need to look at the next generation of entrepreneurs and the companies that they're building now. So you can see that the UN is also pivoting somewhat in this direction through their Entrepreneurs for Social Change program. And what we have, and I see it in the startups that I meet from all around the world, is this new generation of entrepreneurs who think in a fundamentally different way about what business is for. And so they don't have to retrofit all the stuff about purpose and responsibility, because that is baked in from the very start, from inception. And so when you look at the amazing developments that are happening in sustainable entrepreneurship in Africa, for example, all these new ventures that are making all sorts of amazing products from recycled material, you get a sense of what the future could hold. So I'm not saying that we should write off the current generation of global firms, but I don't think that we can rely on them. Okay, so moving from companies to the social sector, the third blockage I want to highlight is the way that we think about scale in the social innovation community. So what happens at the moment in the social impact space is that investors and governments and foundations are looking for projects that have succeeded in one place and asking organizations to replicate them in another place. And it's not working very well. And the reason it's not working very well is that the same social problem often manifests itself very differently in different places. One of the first projects I worked on nearly 20 years ago was about social enterprise support for homeless people in the UK. So you might think that the dynamics of homelessness and the organizational solutions needed to tackle homelessness would be pretty much the same in 2 English cities like, say, Bristol and Liverpool, for example. But the reality on the ground just wasn't like that. There were important local issues, which meant that quite different models were needed for different cities. And when you start to apply the same logic across countries and culture, the challenges get even more significant. So many of you will have heard about the Ashoka Globalizer program, which I think is brilliant. And for those that haven't, it's an initiative launched back in 2009 that takes high potential social innovators through a program designed to help them scale their impact. And it's built around what I think is a really powerful insight, which is summarized on the slide, which is that social innovators need to focus not on scaling their ideas, to focus on scaling their ideas, helping other people to implement their innovations, not on scaling their organizations and doing everything themselves. And so the rationale here is that when initiatives are successful, it's often because the social innovators are deeply embedded in the context where they're working, and it's their local relationships and their local understanding of the issues that are creating the impact. And these dynamics cannot easily be scaled. This is the approach that, the logic that we use in our social enterprise incubator at Cambridge. And when social entrepreneurs realize that they can do this, it's often hugely liberating for them. I remember we had one social entrepreneur that was helping young women who were being in the care system. When she realized that she could grow her impact by empowering other entrepreneurs elsewhere to use her model, it was a transformational moment for her. It took a lot of pressure off her in many ways. I think it's a different mindset, a different mentality, different way of thinking about entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship. And this, I think, is where the impact investment community needs to go with social innovation. And in many ways, I think that the impact investment community is too deferential to ideas about scaling from the business world and from the startup world. Building huge social organizations, delivering across many different places at scale is not necessarily the best way to make social change. Of course, there are some things you can scale like this, product-based ventures or infrastructure, for example. But if you think about the SDGs, a lot of the problems that we're talking about, inequality, for example, are underpinned by a really complex set of social, cultural, and political factors. So forcing impact organizations to become really big often doesn't make sense and actually risks diluting their impact and undermining their sustainability. Okay, so the final blockage I want to talk about is related to the previous one, and it concerns the top-down nature of many of the interventions that we see in the social innovation space, which I think is really excluding and in many cases alienating many of the people that they're designed to help. Now, of course, I completely understand the need for some centralized control. In fact, there are some issues, we were talking about climate, for example, that government or big foundations have got to lead. But there are many other cases, especially, but not only in low-income countries, where communities are having solutions imposed upon them in a way that's not accountable and it's often just not effective. And of course, this is a really difficult issue. I understand this is a really difficult issue. Community participation is not always straightforward. It's time consuming, it's resource intensive, and it's not clear whether true, in inverted commas, participation is even possible in some cases. But we've got to do better, I think, at enabling communities to frame the problems that they face and to develop their own solutions to those problems. There's a really great book that just came out. It's called Constructing Communities by Jeremy Levine at the University of Michigan. And he shows in a really interesting way through an ethnography how many people who are supposed to represent community interests don't actually reflect the dominant view in communities. But there are some amazing examples of bottom-up community development, and I think we need to learn from those. One of the most inspirational initiatives that I came across was actually through somebody I met in Melbourne, a person called Yoko Akama. She's a design researcher at MIT, and she does really amazing work with Indigenous communities across the Asia Pacific. That's about getting communities to develop and share different practices that promote their resilience. It's a really interesting methodology that she uses. And, talking to her is very interesting because, she quite deliberately contrasts her work to the discourse and the language around design thinking and systems change, which from her standpoint privileges expert knowledge over community knowledge. And I think we need more initiatives like the one that Yoko helped to create, because there are some problems that can never be solved in a top-down way. That's the name of the initiative on the slide, Design and Social Innovation in Asia Pacific. Very interesting indeed. Okay. So these are a summary of the four blockages. Capital, which is growing quickly, but often in a way that's not engaged, so it's not actually having the impact that it could. Companies that are talking the language of purpose, but not actually integrating into core strategy. Solutions that are being scaled across different spaces where they're not always appropriate. And a focus on these top-down interventions where communities are being marginalized. Now, I'm not saying these are the only blockages. I'm not saying that there's universal agreement about them, but I think these are important issues that we need to tackle and we need to talk about when we think about how we can achieve the SDGs. We may cover some of this in the panel. So I want to turn now to the issue of climate, because I don't think it's possible to talk about the SDGs without talking about climate. All goals around poverty and inequality get a lot more difficult to achieve if we don't deal with issues around climate. I think this is a very interesting quote on the slide here. One of the big points of contention that's emerged when we think about the SDGs is between growing the wealth and the resources that we need to build a better quality of life for the poorest people in the world. And they need to do that in a way that doesn't exacerbate the climate emergency and pushes well beyond the point of no return when it comes to climate, which is close. And so this is a big issue, clearly. And there are different sets of ideas which different people and different groups are advocating for how we deal with this apparent tension, which I want to cover briefly. So there's one set of ideas around just focusing purely on growth. There's one set of ideas on the flip side, which is about actually shrinking the economy and consuming less. And then there's a third set of ideas, which is becoming increasingly dominant, but are still quite unclear, which is around green growth. So I want to talk about these three sets of ideas and think about how they link to an economic framework for the SDGs. So the first perspective focuses on prioritizing economic growth. I'm not an economist, clearly, but I do work with economists. I've been friends with some of them. And they will say to me sometimes, Paul, you do realize that you're wasting your time with this social innovation stuff, because we all know that the only way to improve people's living standards and bring them out of poverty is to grow the economy. We need to make markets function more effectively. In fact, they sometimes say to me, Paul, you're not just wasting your time, you're actually doing harm, because you're encouraging people in the world's poorest places to create social enterprises when you should really be encouraging them to create profit-maximizing businesses and supporting the institutions needed for businesses to thrive around the world. And they use the example of China, 750 million people, unprecedented history, 750 million people taken out of poverty over the past 30 years. And not because of social innovation, they say, but because of phenomenal economic growth. And so from this perspective, it doesn't really make sense to worry about the environment. The argument being that growth is going to help us stimulate innovation and technology that's going to allow us to solve the sustainability challenges that we face. And also growth is also inversely correlated to birth rates. And so it helps the environment in that way. And this is a view that I think is still quite commonly held among mainline economists. And it's a view that you sometimes hear, albeit less so in the development community as well. On the slide, you see a quote from the UK government's development department in relation to the Millennium development goals, not the sustainable development goals, which I think captures this perspective quite well. Now, I absolutely take the point that we need growth, but this is not a perspective that I find wholly convincing, because from my standpoint, it places too much faith in hypothetical technological solutions that may or may not emerge, and because it doesn't take account of the extreme time pressure that we're under climate. It's a kind of business as usual strategy when we need to be doing things now. But I think this quote does illustrate really succinctly this perspective. So on the other side, we've got the degrowth movement, which clearly prioritizes the environment. Now, the concept of degrowth has its roots in the 1970s, when a group of French activists came up with the idea that the only way that we can build a sustainable future is to consume less. In other words, to make our economy smaller and consistent with the carrying capacity of the planet. And at the time, it was considered much too radical to be taken seriously. But what's really interesting is the way that the discourse of degrowth has started to become more mainstream. There was even an article in Harvard Business Review about it last year by one of my colleagues, Thomas Roulet. And also, I think the work of Jason Hickel, who's an economic anthropologist, has also helped to build its credibility. His work is definitely worth reading, I think. He's very articulate, and he does a really good job, I think, of explaining the science behind the climate emergency and how it links to the way that the global economy is organized. And I think these ideas have made a really important contribution. At the very least, it's highlighted that those of us in high-income countries need to think really, really carefully about everyday consumption decisions and our own footprints. But to be honest, it's just not a viable way forward as an economic framework for the SDGs, because politically, it's not going to be an option, never going to be an option, a realistic option in high-income countries. And for low-income countries, the idea of growing less or not at all just doesn't make any sense. And so if you've got a significant proportion of your population below the poverty line, the last thing you want to do is grow more slowly or even shrink your economy. So that leaves the third option, green growth, which seeks to embrace and harness the tension, really. And the basic premise of green growth is that we can make continued economic expansion compatible with our planet's ecology, that we can decouple economic growth from material and energy use by transitioning to renewables, renewable energy sources, by designing out waste and pollution, and by keeping products and materials in use for as long as possible in a circular way. So the ideas of the circular economy are very closely aligned to this approach. And it's become, I would say, the dominant policy response to the climate emergency. And it's the approach that the UN is advocating as a way of achieving the SDGs in an environmentally sustainable way. And look, I think it presents a huge opportunity as an overarching framework for the SDGs, but at the same time, there are a lot of unanswered questions about what a green growth model for the SDGs actually look like. I mean, I've included on this slide a reference to a paper which I think does a really good job of summarizing what we know, which I think is definitely worth reading by Capasso and colleagues. But for me, and coming back to what we were talking about before, we're not going to be able to to build this new model going forward unless we deal with the 4 blockages that I outlined in the early part of the talk. We need impact averse direct resources initiatives that promote sustainable growth, but also actively engage with companies and social innovators in communities to make sure that capital is used effectively. We also need companies and entrepreneurs to think about sustainability as an opportunity rather than something that they need to be seen to engage with. Otherwise, we're going to get more greenwashing and social washing, or blue washing as it's sometimes called now. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry a couple of weeks ago when British American Tobacco said it was turning into a purpose-driven business. I wasn't quite sure how to process that information. We also need to move away from the idea that universal approaches to sustainable growth can be applied everywhere, and we need to make sure that marginalised communities are able to be involved in developing more sustainable futures for themselves rather than imposing solutions on them. So I see these 2 parts of the talk that I've outlined today as closely connected. The blockages and the way that we need to think about the connection between growth and the environment are both interconnected, and I think we need to consider them both together. Okay, so that brings me to my final slide. There's a lot of interest just now among social scientists in futures research, the systematic analysis of the future. I think Liz was saying that there was a futures researcher who gave this oration a few years ago. But anyways, as social scientists have become more interested in it, I've been reading a lot about it and learning quite a lot about it. And I've sort of taken this picture from it. So this picture here is called the cone of plausibility. And the core idea is that the future is not fixed, and you can use data from the past to predict a range of possible scenarios going forward. So if we were to do this for the SDGs, based on the data that we have at the moment, and when you look at progress to date and how this has been hindered by COVID, we can say that the probable future is that we're not going to meet the SDGs by 2030. We're not going to meet the SDGs by 2030. But this future is not set in stone. There are things we can do to build an alternative future where we move much, much closer to the goals. So the past 18 months have, of course, been difficult ones for all sorts of reasons. We've all spent a lot more time at home by ourselves. And in these circumstances, it's easy, I think, to get drawn into introspection and to feel sometimes that the social challenges that we face, the sustainable goals, are overwhelming, simply unattainable. But it's been really interesting over the past few weeks as I've started to re-engage and meet people again within the social innovation community. As I've gotten back into the classroom in a face-to-face setting, I've been hit by this massive wave of energy and optimism from a whole range of people, sometimes, but not by no means only, but sometimes younger people, not only younger people, who are absolutely committed to building a different path. And by harnessing that energy, that commitment, we can create a more equal, a more sustainable, and a more socially just future. It certainly can be done. It can be done. Thank you very much indeed for allowing me to speak with you this evening.
I would have thought by now I'd be past the having to remind myself to take myself off mute, but I've done it again. Well, thank you, Paul. I mean, having known you for a long time and worked closely with you, I knew you'd deliver something, meaningful and thought-provoking. I think you've done exactly that. And I think this idea of, what's probable versus what's preferable, and how do you sort of bend the line back to where you want it to be, is a really important one. I think it's one that our panel can help us unpick. I'm going to ask Paul to join the panel and move into a discussion, and I think Pete in the backstage and looking after technology will do that. But just before we do that, I mentioned earlier that Gail Peterson is unable to join us tonight, but Gail was very keen to be involved in this discussion and be part of the oration. So she very kindly recorded a video for us. Now, just to give you a bit more about Gail's background and a context for the video, and I should say Gail's background and experience is reflective of the entire panel in lots of ways. Just the depth of experience, the things they've done from policy to sort of boots on the ground and all those sorts of things. It's just incredible. And so I'll introduce all the panel after we've heard from Gail. But Gail's background is that she's advised social investors in more than 45 countries and has taught social investing classes worldwide, including Oxford University, where she's currently an Associate Fellow at the said Business School, the Program Director of Oxford Impact Investing, and a founder of Women Transforming Leadership Program. She's the co-founder and Senior Managing Director of PFC, Social Impact Advisors. And I think one of the extraordinary things about Gail is she has over 25 years of experience, and once again, like a lot of the panel, experience in different parts of the problem and different parts of the opportunity. She's been a strategist, a philanthropist, and a trusted advisor to social investors worldwide, and she's managed and assessed more than $15 billion in philanthropic and impact investments. So I'm sure we can't thank Gail personally, but we will thank her eventually. But I think you'll find the next few minutes of hearing Gail from a video pretty enthralling.
I want to thank the Menzies Foundation for inviting me to participate in this panel. This is an important time, a moment in time for us to reflect and to imagine how capital can be used to make a difference. The Sustainable Development Goals offer us several things. One is a common language. We can define what the greatest problems are facing people and planet, from poverty alleviation to ending slavery, to ending hunger, to addressing climate, to building new partnerships that can change the world. And this is an exciting time with important questions. And I want to address a few of those that my colleagues have raised. One, what's the biggest obstacle with implementing Sustainable Development Goals? We certainly need trillions annually to bridge the gap. But what I'm finding, having 10 years in the classroom with more than 700 senior executives from 90 countries, with investable assets in the trillions, lost in translation is the number one issue that we face. How do we begin to find a common language and in the words of Michael Porter, a shared value? How do we in fact find a way for fishers to communicate with investors, to communicate with government at a scale that will allow us to leverage those trillions? What I find is not that the problems begin with Western countries influencing developing countries, but rather the desire is there, but the inability to communicate effectively and to build partnerships that will last across sectors and divisions that are new and different and difficult. So finding from a foundation perspective, translators and navigators are critically important. And I think the Menzies Foundation, through its leadership initiative, can in fact provide that leadership. We have to find ways for us to bridge the divide of how to make a business case sound for a private sector, which is really the only way we're going to leverage resources in the trillions. Make business models work, but do so not at the expense of the community, but with the community. So finding new ways to build partnerships as a value chain would from the ground up. Working with local fishers to address fishing issues, understanding what the supply chain in fisheries needs as it relates to climate change. Understanding how pieces fit together. And what we really need are navigators and translators, colleagues in this room who can help bridge that divide so that we can in fact exchange ideas, find a common language, and implement a common strategy that will leverage trillions. And I think that's absolutely essential. What I find in terms of some of the most innovative and exciting ideas in impact investing and social finance really are coming from the ground up, from developing countries, whether it's colleagues in the Amazon and in finding new ways to work with indigenous people to create new industries, whether it's colleagues in Australia working with Aboriginal communities in new healthcare innovations, or indigenous people in the Arctic finding new climate change strategies for creating a low carbon economy. Those are innovations that are happening and need to be fostered and encouraged and go to scale. But we need that sensitivity of common language, common purpose, putting our egos aside, finding ways to work together. And that's hard. It's colleagues in business were not trained to be community advocates. Community advocates weren't necessarily trained on how to build effective businesses. Building those connections, educating, informing, creating new collaborative leadership models are absolutely essential. And the SDGs are doing that, but not at the scale and the size that we need, and not building from the ground up as effectively as they can. So finding navigators and translators who can do the lost in translation and build those effective relationships is absolutely essential. And I have great hope, but we need to move quickly. And I think that's the essential challenge. Putting aside our cultural differences, building common strategies, and powerfully understanding the impact that we're having, positively and negatively, on experimentations we might be trying to advance the SDGs. So with that, I want to thank you again for the opportunity. I also want to share some resources. There are several case studies that we use in Oxford that I think would be helpful at reimagining new economic models based on how do businesses adopt sustainable investment policies and practices. One is with Future Fit Foundation, which has done some remarkable work supported by the Partners for New Economy. And we're also working with OECD to reimagine what new models, economic models, would do for businesses moving beyond GDP and looking at new sustainability indicators. Kate Rayworth's work at Donate Economics is a perfect illustration. So imagining what's possible, being brave and taking on new responsibilities, and being fearless. And we call this deliberate leadership in the work that we teach in our students in Oxford and around the world. Courage to recognize you're not alone in the system. The ability to collaborate across sectors. Compassion to put your ego aside and to walk in the shoes of others. Creativity to imagine scenarios that were unimaginable before. To be candid about what's not working so we can adapt and retool. And to make sure that we allow for capital to be defined by human capital, social capital, environmental capital, as well as financial capital. That we see the systems in place, we put our egos aside, and we embrace new ways of thinking. So with that, I wish you well, and I hope one day we'll be able to get together and be in touch. So thank you very much.
Some terrific messages there from Gail, and Liz, please pass on our thanks to Gail next time you're in touch with her. But I think it's interesting. I don't know that she's seen the cone of plausibility that Paul demonstrated, but clearly she thinks that it's still possible to hit those targets by 2030. But it's going to take some effort and some changes to the way things are currently doing. And there's some ideas that we're planning to tease out with our panel. So without any further ado, I'm going to invite the panel up and go through some introductions. So you can see them all on your screen now. They're probably in a different spot on my screen to yours, which is, as you all know, is one of the tricks of Zoom. So let me go through them in the order in which I can see them. So firstly, I want to introduce Mark Ingram, the Chief Impact Officer of Bright Light Bright Light Impact. And Mark's here with us in Melbourne, or at home in Melbourne. Mark spent close to 25 years in the development of international business, and in particular has spent the last decade building inclusive business enterprises with large corporates in emerging markets, which have provided him with market-leading insights into the global impact investing space. His organisation, Business for Development, has won a number of significant prizes: the Shared Value Australia Project Award in 2016, the World Economic Forum New Vision for Development Award in 2017, and the Victorian Exporter of the Year Award in the services sector in 2018. And so with that background, knowledge and experience, it's no surprise to find that Mark's also consulted the Asian Development Bank, the United Nations Development Programme, the World Economic Forum and the Australian Government. I'd now like to introduce Naina Sabawal-Batra, who is the CEO of the Asian Venture Philanthropy Network. The AVPN, I'll go the shortened version. The AVPN is a network of funders and resource providers and is the #1 social investment platform in Asia. Naina joined AVPN as the CEO in 2013 and was also, as well as being the CEO, was also the chair from 2018 to June 2021. In the time that Naina's been part of AVPN, she's more than quadrupled the membership base. And interestingly, I think the mission has grown from focusing only on venture philanthropy, which I'm sure she'll talk more about, to supporting the entire ecosystem of social investors, from philanthropists to impact investors and corporate CSR professionals, and has emerged as a powerful regional force for good. Naina's own special interest, I think, can be recognised by the fact that she's been awarded one of Asia's top sustainability superwomen by CSR Works and serves as a board member of the Global Resilient Cities Network. Naina is also a trustee at the Bridge Institute, which helps leaders of the world's most progressive companies and governments build the skills they need to help their organisations grow, thrive and be a force for good. Prior to joining AVPN, Naina was a part of the senior leadership team in a purpose-driven unit at the Monitor Group, which is a leading global strategy consulting firm which specialised in catalysing markets for social change. I'm not sure how you get any spare time, Naina, but you also have a personal and professional interest in supporting entrepreneurs yourself as a partner and co-founder of a Group 50 Private Limited, curating contemporary Indian art with a view to providing a medium for upcoming and established Indian artists to showcase their work directly to a large and diverse audience. And finally, we have Alex Hannett. Alex is in Brisbane, and Alex is a professor of practice and led the establishment of the Yunus Centre at Griffith University, where he's a co-director. And the Yunus Centre is an innovation centre focused on building knowledge and capability for regenerative futures. Mark has very broad experience in international development, and his roles include the Director of Programs at the Leadership for Environment and Development, or LEAD, as many people watching might know it, the Head of Partnerships at the Climate and Development Knowledge Network, and also the founding CEO of the Akina Foundation, Aotearoa's New Zealand, Aotearoa, which is New Zealand's primary support organisation for social and impact enterprise, and the New Zealand Government strategic partner on sector development, and he's a founding member of New Zealand's National Advisory Board for Impact Investment. Alex also has a role which you may not be aware of, Alex, but you'll certainly be aware of the organisation if you're watching tonight. He's on the board of B-Lab Australia and Aotearoa New Zealand, and which is the certification community building organisation for B Corp. And I think many people are watching tonight would either be B Corp members or B Corp certified, or else aspire to be B Corp certified. So we have an extraordinary range of experience, skills and knowledge that we're going to use to try and unbundle and unpick some of the challenges that Paul has presented. But as Paul has said, there's also some good news in here, so we don't want to think this is all about finding problems. It's also saying, well, how can we build on the opportunities? Well, one of the questions that has come up almost since the SDGs were first developed was, how do we pay for them? And some of you might be familiar with, literally within weeks of the SDGs first being announced, The Economist calculated that the goal of alleviating poverty would require, and that's just one SDG, would require an investment of around $2.5 trillion, that's 2.5 trillion US a year for 15 years. And they referred to the vision of eradicating poverty as fanciful. So on one hand, we've got the question, is there enough capital to significantly address the SDG goals? And the second question relates to how that capital is being deployed. And Paul mentioned in his presentation a report published by Bluemark on some leading impact investors. These are 30 investors with over $99 billion in impact investments, and the Bluemark report found that less than 11% of investors engage with communities, customers, workers, and other stakeholders to invest the impact of their investment. So, Nana, I'm going to put these questions to you first, if I may. Firstly, is the financial horsepower there, is the financial capital there to make a big dent on the SDGs? And secondly, is it being used in a smart way?
Thanks, Colin. And, I want to start by saying a big thank you to Paul. I really, really enjoyed the oration. So thank you, Paul. I think you raised some really important points there. In terms of the funding, the numbers, when we talk about it, the trillions per year, I think it's important to talk about the numbers primarily to raise awareness and to bring urgency to the table. But it's, if we really look at it, Colin, it's not just about raising the trillions of dollars, per year that is required. Even if we were to raise the, $2.5–3 trillion per year that is required to achieve the SDGs, are we really going to achieve success? In my mind, it's much more about changing the rules of the game. And, I think Paul referred to that throughout his oration. It's much more about ensuring that we support innovation and we support the business models that tackle some of the toughest problems through finance. So it's not about the billions that are being deployed through impact investing. It's actually about how much these investors are engaging with their communities, how much are these investors actually engaging with the social entrepreneurs. So I believe that, we can, through the power of collaboration and innovation, led by the social investment sector, led by impact investing, scale impact to make a transformative change in our communities. So I'll give you one quick example before I hand it back to you. For example, the pandemic, and we've all talked about it, has revealed huge cracks. It's pushed us back a number of years in terms of achieving the SDGs, but it's also revealed tremendous cracks in the healthcare system. And with travel restricted, what we found across our network, investors were no longer being able to fund local entrepreneurs, local businesses in Asia as they used to. The problem was that, they couldn't really travel to do the due diligence, and therefore investors were reluctant to commit the funding. AVPN launched a pooled fund in Southeast Asia. It was the first pooled fund of its kind, which we found to be a really effective vehicle on two fronts. Funders could use the pooled fund to come together to disburse money to organizations across the healthcare ecosystem in a non-disparate way. And donors could come together and not just pool their capital, but also pool their expertise to create impact in a much greater way than they could as individuals. So I think besides focusing just on the amount of capital that is needed, which I do believe there is enough, especially if we look at investment capital, if we look at business capital, we need to focus on a new way of investing and a new way of doing business if we are to really achieve the SDGs in their true sense.
Nana, I know that Alex and Mark will both have something to say on this point, so I'll go to them in a minute. But I wonder if you could just expand a little bit more about providing funding in a non-disparaging way, because I think that's a really important issue.
So I think, again, we talked about what exactly is funded. Are you funding the team? Are you funding, the sort of the idea? Where we are looking at in terms of the pooled fund, a lot of times when we look at funding, especially funding for impact, funders, predominantly philanthropic funders, tend to look at funding projects and programs. The non-disparate way is actually to look at organizational funding, to look at funding that is not tied to a specific program so that it can be used to fund innovation, so that the capital can be used to actually take on more risk, have a greater appetite for risk, so that you can try out new models, you can try out new innovations, and it can also be used to fund the organization's growth if and where it's needed, depending on the entrepreneur making that choice. So that's what I meant by non-disparate funding.
Great, thank you for explaining that. Alex, I might throw to you. I'm sure you've got a view on this.
I think, the figure of total wealth in the world is about sort of 430 odd trillion. So you would have thought with the right settings and the right incentives, there could be some degree of reallocation there. I think the other question to ask is, if we aren't moving towards the Sustainable Development Goals, to what degree is that value going to be destroyed? So, I think there's some very sort of clear reality checks in sort of framing this thinking around, is there enough money? And not least, I think $6 trillion of liquidity was put into the system as a result of the COVID pandemic. So it's within our means to do these things, if there's the will. But I think Naina's point about the deployment is absolutely critical. I think in a lot of cases, even within impact investing, we're kind of using old models of investment to try and do new models of innovation. So whether you're talking about trying to think about allocating resources to a whole swathe of people that are actually left out of innovation, what are the mechanisms which allow that to happen? Rethinking the mindsets in terms of the biases around who determines creditworthiness. And I think, Naina was pointing to that a little bit. And then also recognizing we're facing systemic complex challenges. So we need, again, capital allocation models which match up to that complexity. So if you're thinking about, trying to, get a systems transition around the Amazon, there are so many different interventions which need to be connected or at least coherent. And to have an investment model which can cope with that and be adaptive to things as they change is just outside of our vocabulary at the moment. So we need that. It's not just the allocation of capital, it's the innovation and the mindsets of how we allocate that capital.
Mark, I'll go to you.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. A lot has already been said, so I'll take a practitioner perspective. In the past, when I worked in inclusive business, we found that the tactility of business leaders getting in situ, understanding the needs of communities, actually experiencing for themselves, people in their supply chains, led to transformation. And I've seen the same with investors. The more they have tactility, which we can often be so isolated, especially here in Australia, from where human need exists, and it can feel intangible. To be able to get that personal experience has made a noticeable difference. You got to have the right business models for sure. The capital's there, we've already mentioned that. But I think a key to me is tactility. So I'm not an academic, but if I had a theory of change, with COVID, it would be human behavior in crisis, and when we have greater exposure to human need, it does catalyze a change in human response. So my encouragement coming through COVID is we see the need, as Naina had suggested. It's improving consciousness. Now we're going to get tactile with the issues and find out ways to do that.
Great. Thanks, Mark. One of the other things that Paul spoke about was that a lot of the SDGs, and this is my summation, so Paul might have a different view or want to explain it differently, so feel free to jump in, Paul. But in a sense, there's a lot of sort of top-down. We're imposing global ideas on local communities. And I think, Paul, the example you gave was your own experience looking at homelessness in 2 different English cities. And yet we're trying to do the same thing across 17 SDGs, and I think 161 measurements and all those sorts of things. Is there, I suppose the other part of this is that local knowledge also has a social and cultural value. And so is part of the challenge that we're trying to find global solutions to what are essentially local problems? Mark, maybe I'll start with you on that, because I know you've done a lot of work around economic development and local development.
Feedback loops are really important. One thing I'm seeing absent from impact investing is getting more authentic data coming from the field to inform the way interventions are A, funded, and B, how do we see well-being improvements coming back from the capital that we allocate. So it's critical to get the voice of those communities we seek to benefit. And it may sound obvious, But in impact investment, we don't think too much about the impact on beneficiaries. And so I'm encouraged by a plethora of remote survey businesses that are spawning because we have to do things remotely now. We're thinking about new innovations about how we get data from the field. In the international development, it's usual practice to get feedback loops. In investment, less so. We need to fuse the two communities together to get a better series of feedback loops that will help us refine the kind of interventions we need to deploy.
Right. Mark, sorry, Alex, maybe I'll put the same question to you, because once again, I know you've had lots of experience in the field dealing with local communities.
Yeah, I mean, my first comment would be, I think the SDGs are most powerful when they're actually used as a directional or a narrative device rather than something more literal. And progress towards them is not going to be a planning approach. I mean, so that whole idea about possible futures, that I don't think relates to choices that we make now. It's around emergence within complex systems. And so some of those futures don't start to actually become possible until we start to do things. So a planning approach is completely, incompatible with the reality of trying to work with a lot of these big issues. But absolutely, context is key. And I think, sort of Paul referenced this, again, around the whole idea of like scale is just a really sort of reductive idea. You can aim for similar outcomes, but context is absolutely going to determine how those outcomes can be pursued and who's involved. So for me, then it sort of comes down to how are you creating a kind of an enabling environment or a new innovation infrastructure to support any range of bottom-up actions which are held together with that kind of coherence of the SDGs, but are enabling, sort of a mass unlocking of creativity and innovation, not just in privileged places, but, we're leaving so much capacity out of the system at the moment because we're actually privileging a relatively small number of people in kind of change processes. So I think that's the really big question. Previously we've made these massive step changes around the public health system or the welfare state. What would it look like to unlock the creative capacity of humans across the planet? And what would be the social infrastructure that we could put in place to potentially bring that forth?
Nate, I noticed you nodding in agreement with some of Alex's points. I wonder if there was anything you wanted to add.
No, I build on Alex's point. I actually think it's really crucial, if we combine local and indigenous knowledge with new information, with innovation, that is far more likely to drive, scalable social innovations. And I'll give you an example. I think Gail also kind of referred to this in her video. So, we've realized working with our member, the Ministry of Creative Economy in Indonesia, the government and the organizations of indigenous peoples, when they work together to develop forestry policies that take into consideration the land and resource rights and the views of the indigenous peoples, providing the communities with land tenure options, providing the communities with training, especially around fishery, which is a really big industry in Indonesia, and providing them with updated techniques, we find that there is far more sort of progress to address sort of growth, economic progress, keeping in mind climate change, keeping in mind sustainable forest management. So if you don't keep these kind of feedback loops in place, you don't keep the cultural connotations in hand when you're looking at, what kind of solutions you're designing, I think that's where the second kind of point that Paul brought up in terms of climate versus progress really kind of gets, sort of that divide comes much more sharply in focus.
Paul, I just have this feeling that you'd like to say something about this one as well.
I completely agree with what the panel are saying. That there's some things that you can do in a top-down manner. You can build infrastructure, for example, in a top-down way. But really, what we need to do is to leverage the insights from in a broader way, to leverage community knowledge. And as I think Alex had said before, it's not that the resource isn't there. The sort of resource that we're talking about in the scheme of the global economy is actually not that huge. It's not that big. It's about how do we embrace this local knowledge and innovation and capacity to really move to the next stage.
Thank you. One of the things that you spoke about, Paul, was about the role of business, and I think most people on this call would be familiar with Michael Porter, and I think as people know, probably 2 decades ago, he became very passionate about the idea of shared value, and he said quite publicly that shared value is about a combination of entities. But he really thought that business was the entity or the type of organisation that would make a difference. They had the resources, the human capital, the social capital, the financial capital to make a difference. And yet, I think as a couple of speakers have already referenced, on one hand, we've sort of seen issues of blue washing and green washing and what have you. But even if we put those aside, is this a case of saying, look, a lot of businesses are well intentioned, but they're sort of missing the mark? I don't want to put words in people's mouths, but I've heard discussions that a lot of people see SDGs as something that the SDG department does, whereas Porter always envisions it as a sort of central part of an organisation, like everything incorporates the SDGs. Maybe I could ask you to lead off on this one, Alex, and tell us a bit about your experience working with corporates on the SDGs.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm sort of coming to this. I think the first thing I'd go to is the role of business. What about the role of customers and citizens? Because ultimately, sort of businesses will follow to the preference of their customers. I think business has an important role to play, but I think it's also sort of overly simplistic to think that they're going to be the primary actor, and also recognizing the nature of business is dynamic and changing. So without any doubt, there are kind of, bad actors, dinosaurs, which are trying to sort of get everything before they're forced to move. But there are a range of, sort of businesses which, I think are demonstrating their commitment towards moving towards the SD agenda by being more accountable. So being that by standards, so you mentioned I'm on the board of, B Lab. It's not to say that all B Corps are by all means, impeccable, but they are being transparent and actively working around how they change their behaviours across community, employees, governance, direct impact products and services and environment. And then there's also a diverse range of businesses. So the whole social enterprise movement around the world is kind of one of the globe's best kept secrets. You would have thought governments would be going out of their way to support organisations which were creating multiple forms of value and finding to a certain degree financial sustainability while doing that. Also, I think there's a renaissance in the cooperative movement. It's always been there, but fundamentally different ways of sharing ownership and power and resources. And I think something that's really exciting is not necessarily specific cooperatives, but more mainstream businesses moving into employee ownership arrangements, and how that then directly changes the sort of the interests and the behaviour of businesses. And lastly, I think there's a lot of emphasis on corporates because of their size, but the whole role of local businesses and local living economies, I think, is something easily overlooked. And at that point, you have any range of actors who can influence how those economies are developed. So we've done a lot of work on anchor institutions. Universities have a lot of buying power. They've got big balance sheets. They've got physical assets. How are they actually proactively supporting the right types of businesses who are creating other forms of value in their localities? And of course, government also has the opportunity to shape markets as well. So government has to be proactive in incentivizing the outcomes it believes are in the public interest, rather than just fixing markets when they go wrong. So business is important, but it's a whole system game.
Nana, maybe I could just ask you for your thoughts on this, because I know at the AVPN you're dealing with generally successful business people of different sizes, and clearly they're all keen to get involved in making the world a better place. How do they go about it? How do they sort of engage communities and I guess take on the role of trying to deliver on the SDGs in their businesses, not just in their sort of philanthropic activities, or do the two mesh together for them?
So I think businesses have, I think there's been a far greater increase in the rhetoric that businesses have started saying, or at least articulating about profit with purpose, looking at the SDGs, looking at how they can be better corporate citizens. But I think Alex made a very, very valuable point. It's not just about what businesses are saying, it's about who holds them accountable. And that's where, customers, investors, shareholders, the markets that, they list in, the government, the regulatory bodies, all play a really important role. I mean, you talked about B Corps, and the B Corp movement is a very important movement. We all know that, we had, I think there was great rejoicing when Danone got declared as a B Corp. You had a big multinational company that said it was now a registered B Corp. But then the CEO got overhauled on the coals by investors saying, it wasn't just good enough to focus on purpose. Profit was still by far much more important. So what is the message that we actually are giving? And that's where in AVPN, what's been interesting is, we have a lot of family offices that are our members, who are actually the investors in some of these large corporates. And what has been the change in the trend is, with the sort of the wealth moving to the next generation, there is a lot more interest in seeing where their investment dollars are really going, and to actually then demand accountability from those investee organizations. And I think that's where we will see the difference come in, when investors actually ask companies to say, hey, what are you doing with our investment money? Are you really walking the talk? That's one. The second is obviously, governments, they have a role to play. They need to be, sort of making it mandatory that businesses report where exactly are they on sustainability, where exactly are they in terms of meeting the SDGs. One of the issues with the SDGs has been that while a lot of, because as we all know, there are 17 SDGs with, a huge number of sub-goals, it's been easy for corporates to say, I am meeting SDG this by doing this, without really showing you how that's really happening. So there isn't really that, it's blue washing, green washing, white washing, whatever washing you want to call it. But there's a lot of that happens without a clear roadmap. And until and unless customers and investors ask, where exactly is this link and how credible is this link, I don't think that change is going to happen in a hurry.
Thank you. Mark, I know you've had a lot of experience advising corporates and government around the SDGs. Maybe you could share some of that with us.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said, and I'll give a quick snapshot story. So that reinforces my crisis theory of change, Colin, that I'm going to develop my thesis and submit it eventually. But in 2012, the Rana Plaza collapse happened in Bangladesh, and a lot of scrutiny was put on the supply chain of clothing companies. One of those companies was Cotton On Group, and they looked at their supply chain. And the first thing was disclosure of where they were sourcing their goods. The next was to look at living wage and the conditions of the factories. But then behind the factories were farmers that they discovered were earning less than $2 a day. There was child labor involved. And by taking their executive team to meet some of the cotton farmers that we were able to do in Africa, you got the tactility. They looked at their supply chain, how they could disintermediate, buy directly from a farmers cooperative, double their income, gain a loyal supply of farmers over the long term for their supply chain, and be able to illustrate the benefit of greater accountability in embedding something into their core business model that solved poverty for 10,000 farmers. So it can be done, but like Gail was saying at the start of proceedings, trusted intermediaries that can catalyze those kind of opportunities is the kind of work I think that's needed en masse.
Thank you. One of the issues that Paul mentioned, and I think it's very top of mind with everyone right at the moment, given the situation in Afghanistan, is gender equality. And if there's a particular SDG that gets most criticism for the lack of progress, it's gender equality. And that seems to be not just an issue about that particular SDG, but there are plenty of commentators who say none of the goals are achievable if we can't achieve goal 5, which is about gender equality. And yet we still see these issues across the world, from child marriage, which, as I mentioned, Paul's done some outstanding research on. We're all sort of incredibly apprehensive about the situation in Afghanistan. The number of women who are still in slavery around the world. There are more women in slavery around the world than the entire number of slaves who were involved in the transatlantic slave trade over 300 years. And so what can be done? I mean, what's happening around gender equality, and what can people do to make a difference? And Nana, I know this is a question dear to your heart, so maybe I'll start with you.
No, thank you so much, Colin, for bringing it up. Yes, it's a question that's very close to my heart, and I think very close to what we are trying to do at AVPN. In the context of today's discussion, I think gender lens investing is something that we are pushing out very, very strongly. And I know that both Liz and Mark are going to be on our Gender Lens Fellowship program. So thank you so much for joining that. It's when we talk about gender lens investing, it's not just about investing in companies that are led by women. It's more about looking at every business that actually keeps women in mind when they're designing products. It looks at leadership opportunities for women. It looks at, are women customers kept in mind when a product is rolled out. It talks about who actually owns the capital, who makes that decision, how much are women allowed to kind of progress. So I think gender lens investing is a great way for investors, for businesses to look at moving SDG 5 along. But investment alone is not going to do it. We have to also look at philanthropic capital. We have to look at what is the other kinds of investments that governments are going to do to ensure that all the kind of goals that are related to women and girls is actually met. So what are we doing to keep girls in school? What are we doing to make sure that child marriage doesn't happen? What are we doing with women's reproductive health? So it kind of touches every step of the way. I'll give you an example. We talk about innovation. We talk about innovation in social enterprises. When I was working with Monitor, we did a lot of work around business models that were at the base of the pyramid. One of them was a low-cost maternity hospital. And just if you look at it, the number of women today that actually still die in childbirth is it's crazy to really think that still happens in today's day and age. LifeSpring is a low-cost maternity hospital that can be accessed by sort of lower income communities across India. It's been a social enterprise that actually received initially catalytic funding, then scaled, got investment funding, got impact investors interested in it. So it is also possible to see that there are business models out there that address some of these issues that are also investment worthy, that do well, that scale. So I think looking at more of these kinds of business models, more of these kinds of social enterprises will also help us with Goal 5.
Well, thank you, Nana. I mean, what a comprehensive answer, and thank you for your contribution on that question. I'm not sure if anyone else in the panel wanted to talk on that particular SDG, but it's clearly
very quickly in 30 seconds, yep. Colin. You go into smallholder farming communities and you engage, and the blokes will gather, but then you look out in the field and it's the women doing the work, and so often it's a problem of not hearing from the right voices. And so the men are trained, but the women are actually doing the farming. So how we recalibrate who we listen to is critical.
I must admit, when I saw Alex's background and the name of his centre, I thought, there's a model for investing in women that goes back, 30 years now, I think, Alex, through Mohammed Yunus, which has been unbelievably successful. And yet we still haven't sort of learned a lot from that model, apart from trying to replicate it in other parts of the world. But we haven't sort of learned how to think creatively about that issue. I'm not sure if there's anything you want to say on that, Alex. I'm sort of talking about something you know a lot more than me about.
Look, I mean, very little to add really, apart from, I mean, certainly with the enterprises, the social enterprises, or the enterprises which have, I mean, any number of the SDGs at their heart, absolutely overrepresented by female founders. Yeah, yeah, there's the gender issue is a really big one, and probably not for now and here, but yeah, it's absolutely fundamental to, I think, sort of our future prospects.
And just I've got one more question, and this is to some degree, I think, well, they're all elephants in the room, I guess, but the issue of climate change. I mean, in the last month, we've seen floods, we've seen wildfires across Europe, across North America. You ask anyone who works in political science, they'll tell you there'll be more wars fought over access to water than almost any other cause in the next 50 years. And there's already that's already taking place. I saw a report this morning saying that people in Nevada, the site of America's biggest dam, are going to have their water supply cut by 20%. And that includes exporting water to Mexico, which is also having their supply cut down. So across the world, we're seeing this issue about climate change. And yet, to Paul's point before, and Paul, it's good to see that the spirit of Milton Friedman lives on in the economics department at Cambridge University. But does this trade-off between the climate and economic growth have to be a zero-sum game? Does one have to give for the other one to work? I'm not going to call anyone in particular. I'm happy for anyone to take that question.
I'll give it a go at start point, but no, because where the greatest development is needed is in the least contributors to the climate change problem. And talking about Eunice, Colin, he said to me when we hosted him years ago in Australia, the world's got an inverted pyramid where all the decisions are made by the elite, but the world's population is like this. And the darkest parts of the world in terms of energy consumption are the ones that make up the majority of the world's population. So if we invert the way we think to focus on the voices of those who are most in need and the least contributors to climate as a challenge, I think that's a key solution. And Paul pointed to the degrowth proposition of perhaps the top as well being needed.
Alex, go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, I mean, just again on sort of, I suppose the equity, sort of piece that I think 1%, of the population of the world have emitted more than 100 times more than the bottom 50%. So when we speak about the kind of, the trade-off, we're actually talking about a trade-off between a very small elite and a significant majority. So there's massive inequity in the climate change, economic growth discussion. I mean, the second thing is, the whole kind of framing around growth for what ends. Growth is a means, not an end in itself. Well-being is presumably, the end that we all seek, So it seems in some ways kind of a flaw that we have this focus on growth rather than the focus on the outcomes which we actually want, which to a certain degree, the SDGs are starting to actually kind of provide that holistic and independent way of thinking about what good looks like. And I mean, I guess, the last thing, I do think there's this massive kind of denialism in so much as we can see that the climate impact is non-linear. There will be increasing feedback loops, but we're still talking about only getting to a point of stabilizing emissions sometime like in about 30 years. I mean, so I think there's just a massive kind of credibility gap between the reality of that we're living and this idea that we can have a very orderly, sort of progression to a kind of a good outcome. So, I mean, I think there's going to be increased discontinuity, and that's going to undermine our ability to then adapt to make the changes that we need.
And Nana, you live in a part of the world that really sees this problem in a big way. The sort of push for economic growth, I guess, and economic development versus the sort of natural resources that have to be sacrificed, I guess, for that economic development to take place. So I was just wondering how you see that. Well, trade-off's probably the wrong word. How you see those two things working together.
I think Mark had it right, where we really need to invert that and look at the communities on the ground, because, growing up in a country, in a developing country, I can tell you we've gone backwards as we have in terms of sustainability, in terms of recycling as economic progress has happened. So if you really look at entrepreneurs that are in the communities where their climate footprint is really minimalist, the kind of innovations and the kind of solutions that they have are far less harmful on the climate than as we are looking at solutions that come from the West and from more industrialized countries. So I think it's a question of what is the kind of development we are pushing and what are the models that we are pushing. Do we need to look at more indigenous models that actually work for these communities, or are we looking at propagating a very Western oriented model for development? And I think that's the answer when we really need to look at what is well-being and what is development, and in whose context are we actually referring to that.
Great. Thanks, Nona. Well, we've just about run out of time. Paul, I'm just going to ask you if you've got any final comments you'd like to make before I finish up proceedings.
Well, I think I just really enjoyed the panel. The one thing I was going to say when we were talking about SDG 5 on gender equality, that it's important not to remember that it's not just low-income countries that have issues with SDG 5. I'm sitting in the university sector, the business school sector, where there aren't many female faculty where I work. So this is a much broader problem than just thinking about low-income countries. And I also think, the points made at the very end about sustainability were so important. Clearly, if we are exporting this Western model of growth to the global South, then we're going to be in trouble. And I think this is actually an opportunity to think about a different type of growth. And if we get this right, then I think that people in the high-income countries are going to have a lot to learn. So there's going to be some reverse translation of knowledge here, I think. So I think this is an opportunity to think about a different type of growth, a more sustainable growth. And I think that people in high-income countries are going to have a lot to learn from that process.
Thanks, Paul. Well, we have just run out. I'm very sorry to say we have just about run out of time. Normally, if we're all in Melbourne, we'd take you out for dinner and keep this conversation going for a couple of days, I think. Duncan, you may have something to say about this, but I mean, this is an important conversation from a university perspective. The way we teach people, the things that we research, the things that we show the world that we think are important, and the contribution we make to knowledge around the SDGs. So, on behalf of the university, I just want to thank you all for the contribution you've made tonight. It's been informative, it's been interesting, it's been uplifting, it's been hard-nosed, I think, in some respects, and it's sort of been real, if you like. But I think more than anything, it's been enlightening. So, thank you to Paul, Nona, Alex, and Mark. Thank you to Liz and to Sarah, who I know is working backstage for helping us put this together. And I'd also like to thank everyone who's sort of joined us tonight. Everyone's got their own challenges during COVID-19, and I think to try and find an hour and a half at the moment, it's either really easy or really hard, depending on whether the Amazon guy's delivering something or whether your Coles deliveries turning up or whatever else, whether your kids are doing homeschooling and what have you. So everyone's had to sort of do their own thing, I guess, to get along tonight. But finally, to Peter Jobling and the board of the foundation, thank you for your support for the oration, and just the people I work with at the uni. Tim Bright, who's been the sort of guiding hand behind this sort of backstage. Amanda Curry, who works in Duncan's office, who has a lot of experience with events and helps us work through all the things we need to do to stage these events, and people that you won't see, but Maddie and Pete at Offstage, who, as you can imagine, doing this is a bit of a high wire act technically, with people in different locations and having to rely on technology and what have you. So to Maddie and Pete at Offstage, thank you for your support. Liz, I'm just sorry we can't do this again next week because I've got a whole lot more questions I could ask. I've also got a bunch from the audience that I didn't even get a chance to look at. So, informative, exciting, intriguing, interesting, and I just think a perfect way to have a wonderful oration. So thank you all very much. And on that note, I'll finish the proceedings for the evening.